I want to thank the chairman and the committee for the opportunity to provide my perspective on the subject of climate change and its possible impact on the citizens of the Commonwealth. I will review many rarely revealed facts that undercut the notion that our changing climate is influenced primarily by human-caused greenhouse gas increases, and that those changes are having serious negative impacts on the Earth's ecosystems and humanity. My qualifications include degrees in geology from Waynesburg University and West Virginia University. And of the papers I've authored or co-authored, one is of particular significance to this committee, as I was co-author of the first comprehensive peer-reviewed paper on the Marcellus Shale, with particular emphasis on how the paleoclimate may have affected deposition of the organic-rich productive facies. Geology may be the branch of science that's most appropriate to explore our changing climate because it places temperature and carbon dioxide data in the long-term perspective that's severely needed to adequately assess the last 150 years or so and their significance or lack thereof. Climate change and the efforts to control the Earth's temperatures through reductions in carbon dioxide is not an abstract concept separate from the lives of Pennsylvanians. There are currently two proposals in the state that will significantly affect the state and its citizens. The first is a petition for rulemaking that was filed in November of 2018 to the State Environmental Quality Board to set up a comprehensive cap-and-trade program for the state. The overall effect of this would be to increase gas costs, energy costs for all companies emitting CO2, and to make Pennsylvania less competitive compared to adjoining states that do not have such a process. The plan has a goal of zero emissions by the year 2052. The second proposal is the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which is a multi-state collaboration designed to achieve substantial reductions in transportation sector emissions for the participating states. The proposal is currently before Governor Wolf and the DEP, and they have until November of this year to determine the specifics. We're not clear on the details at this point. However, it's certain that taxes on diesel and gasoline would need to be increased and that neighboring states not participating in this attempt to control the uncontrollable, which is to say the climate of the 4.5 billion year old Earth. Both of these proposals would have serious ramifications for the state and its citizens. Because of this, the governor and this committee should make recommendations that are based on science and facts, not a politically driven and media-driven narrative of Earth spiraling into man-made planetary doom. One of the two principles of natural justice recognized in the law of the English-speaking countries is audiatur et altera pars, or let both sides be fairly heard. In the climate change debate, the actual science deniers are those found to be promoting the so-called consensus opinion of harmful man-made warming, while silencing any critics or science that does not support this idea. This has been made clear many times over, but was highlighted last year when I offered to speak to a professor's class after he was highly critical of me. He declined strongly, saying he didn't want his students exposed to this kind of science. It wasn't that I was wrong, it just didn't fit his narrative. In this presentation, we will look first at both the recent and historical trends of carbon dioxide and temperature, and then look at some of the many climate catastrophes that are predicted to occur due to man-made climate change. Please note that all figures included in this printed copy of the presentation are fully sourced and referenced to either government institutions or peer-reviewed studies. A full list of references is provided as an appendix. Everyone in this room has heard reference to a 97% consensus of scientists that agree with the idea of man-made catastrophic warming, otherwise known as the consensus opinion. The authors of the paper on which the statistic is derived cast a wide net to get to that number because, according to their definition, I would be included in the 97%. That's because I recognize that the addition of carbon dioxide since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution has warmed the atmosphere to some degree. There's some important issues concerning climate change that likely 97% of all scientists can agree to. First, the atmosphere has warmed about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 150 or so years. Second, CO2 has been increasing. Third, increasing CO2 is mainly from the combustion of fossil fuels. And last, increasing CO2 is warming the atmosphere. The three basic questions that differentiate the large and growing community of scientists that are skeptical of catastrophic man-made warming and those who are promoting the consensus viewpoint are summarized below. First, concerning the warming over the last 150 or so years, is it primarily naturally driven, or is it due to increases in greenhouse gases? Next, are our current temperatures and rate of warming unusual and unprecedented? And last, is the recent climate change harmful or might it be beneficial? We're told that our current and projected carbon dioxide levels are unusually high and dangerous. Are they? The current CO2 level is a little over 400 parts per million. That number is about 130 parts per million higher than the concentration at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Human emissions of CO2 since the start of the Industrial Revolution rose very slowly until the middle of the 20th century, when we began adding gas in earnest during that post-World War II economic boom. If we are to recognize CO2-driven warming, it's in that period, in the post-mid-20th century. It's important to understand that carbon dioxide concentration decreases during each ice age and increases during each of the interglacial periods, like we're in right now. The reason for that is the oceans are the main regulator of CO2, and cold water absorbs more CO2 while warming oceans expel it. Looking at the last several 100,000 years of data, it's clear that the current level of gas is higher by more than 100 parts per million than other past interglacial periods. When viewed in this historical context, the concentration appears to be alarmingly high. That's why we need to look at it in the longer geologic context. And looking in that context throughout Earth's history, we find that our current concentration is actually very low. The average CO2 level before our current geologic period was 2,600 parts per million. That's more than 6 times the current level, and it was often more than 10 times our modern level. During these times of very high CO2, Earth's ecosystems thrived. The big takeaway from this chart of 140 million years of data is that the planet's CO2 levels have been in a significant and dangerous decline. Looking at the last 140 million years of data, the concentration has fallen nearly linearly to the dangerously low levels when Earth's CO2 concentration reached 172 parts per million at the end of the last ice age. This is thought to be the lowest level of carbon dioxide since before the Cambrian period, when complex multi-cell animals became more common. And why is this dangerously low? Because 150 parts per million is the minimum threshold for most plant life to exist, and it's what I call the line of death. If that level of 150 parts per million were ever reached, that would be a true climate apocalypse, and we nearly reached it in the not-too-distant geologic past. Increasing CO2 assures that we will avert an ecological disaster of crossing that line of death. It's been well documented that more CO2 directly benefits plant growth. In addition to enhanced plant growth from increases in this miracle molecule, the increase means that plants require less water, which leads to an increase in soil moisture. We will see in just a bit that this planet-wide increase in soil moisture may be the primary reason that both droughts and forest fires have been in a long-term decline. Laboratory studies by Dr. Craig Idso and his team showed that a 300 part per million increase in CO2 on 45 crops translated into a 46% increase in biomass for these plants. This means that increasing CO2 will help to feed a growing population. Bear in mind that the plants on which we rely first evolved and prospered when CO2 levels were up to 10 times today's levels. According to proponents of harmful man-made warming like Dr. Michael Mann of Penn State and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, temperature increases over the last 150 years or so are unusual and unprecedented. Acceptance of our current temperatures as unusual and unprecedented is a necessary requirement for the consensus theory. Because if indeed our recent temperatures are unusual and unprecedented, that would be strong evidence that the increase of greenhouse gases are the primary driver of temperature during that time frame. One of the problems in discussing the planet's temperature history is the relatively short time frame of available measured data. The longest global thermometer temperature record dates back to 1850, while the first climate satellites were only launched in 1979, providing only 40 years of data. The most commonly used graph to link CO2 increases to temperature uses data only back to 1850. And if we add CO2 emissions to that chart, an apparent correlation between the two arises. However, correlation is not causation. Placing this data in a much needed longer perspective is informative. In fact, the apparent correlation disappears. Our current warming trend actually began in the late 17th century, more than 300 years ago, and long before we began adding significant amounts of CO2 to the atmosphere. Importantly, during the first 150 or so years, this warming trend was 100% naturally driven, and the temperature increases during that naturally driven period look very similar to the last 150 or so years when it is claimed to be driven by increases in greenhouse gases. So I ask you, did those non-greenhouse natural drivers of temperature changes suddenly stop in the beginning of the 20th century? The warming that began in the year 1695 brought the planet out of the death-dealing cold of the Little Ice Age. This cold period was marked by crop failure, famine, and mass depopulation because of naturally occurring global cooling. Earth and humanity have benefited greatly from what's been called the long, slow thaw and the gradual warming of the planet. It is vitally important to place our current temperature trend into an even longer-term geologic perspective by looking at detailed data from ice cores from Antarctica and Greenland. Using this information, dating back to the end of the last ice age, we find that there have been 9 other warming trends that look very similar to our own, and all of which ended with much higher temperatures than we have today. Many thousands of historical documents confirm that the 3 most recent warming trends were much warmer than today. Our retreating glaciers are now exposing settlements, and the stumps of fully mature trees that were part of forests that existed during those previous warming periods. Contrary to what you're being told, warming trends such as our current one have always been correlated to times of great prosperity and plenty. Before climate science became politicized, these warm periods were called climate optima because they were beneficial to both humanity and the Earth's ecosystems. Crops were bountiful, great empires arose, and there's a strong correlation between the rise and fall of temperatures and the rise and fall of civilizations. Technical and cultural advances were made possible by the plentiful food. It was the intervening cold periods that were horrific. These cold periods were accompanied by crop failure, famine, and mass depopulation. And during the most recent cold of the Little Ice Age, half the population of Iceland perished. It's thought that as much as 1/3 of the total population on Earth died. History tells us clearly that we should not fear a bit of extra warming, but rather fear increasing cold. We are warned that unless we stop burning fossil fuels and adding CO2, the planet will experience a long list of horrific consequences from inexorably rising temperatures. The climate calamities include increasing fires, droughts, floods, heat waves, and temperature-driven deaths, to name a few. Yet the facts say otherwise. In reality, Earth and by extension humanity are prospering and thriving. The predicted climate apocalypse events are predictions based on climate models used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that, according to Dr. John Christie, overpredict warming by 2.5 to 3 times too much compared to actual temperature change. It's important to separate rank speculation about what might happen 30, 50, or 80 years in the future based on these failed climate models from what's actually happening in the real world. Time and again, we find that the science and facts contradict what we're being told. Increased drought and desertification are said to be increasing due to man's influence, but the facts say otherwise. Vegetation around the globe is expanding rapidly due to increased soil moisture and plant growth that is turbocharged by the effect of increasing CO2 fertilization. According to NASA, up to 50% of the Earth is greening or experiencing growth of vegetation, while less than 4% is browning or undergoing decreasing plant growth. Formerly arid areas with desert conditions are now blossoming across much of the planet. China, Australia, India, and many other nations are benefiting from this greening. Likely the most stunning turnaround has been occurring in the southern Sahara in an area known as the Sahel, where more than 300,000 square kilometers of former desert are turning into a lush grassland, with people moving back into areas where they've not lived for more than 1,000 years. Animals are moving back in. Gazelles, even amphibians, are moving into this now greening area. According to the experts who study this, the greening of the planet is mainly attributable to the increase in carbon dioxide, which is fueling plant growth. Several other factors are in play here, including increased precipitation owing to the warming temperature and a retreat of the tundra in high latitudes and elevations. Forest fires are one of the primary climate apocalypse events linked to global warming. The fourth National Climate Assessment that was published in November of last year flatly stated that fires are increasing due to climate change, and they predicted that they were expected to increase. The facts show just the opposite is happening, and the experts tell us that the decline is due to climate change. The number of fires, along with the area burned in the United States, has declined by approximately 80% since the beginning of the 20th century, according to the National Interagency Fire Center. This reduction in fires is supported by a study of area burned globally that stated our results suggest a notable declining rate of burned area globally. And a study by the Canadian Fire Service stated, we believe that global warming since 1850 have triggered decreases in fire frequency in some regions, and future warming may even lead to further decreases in fire frequency. Let's restate that. Global warming is causing a decrease in the number of fires, according to the Canadian Fire Service. Even in California, the number of fires has decreased roughly by half in the last 30 or so years. During that period, the area burned has increased, meaning that each fire is at least twice as large as decades ago. But that's not a global warming issue. That's a forest management issue. In the past, forest management included logging, thinning, grazing, and controlled burns, all of which have declined in the face of pressure from environmental groups, and the unintended result has been larger and more intense fires. The link between decreasing fire and climate are most likely related to the same increasing soil moisture content that is helping to green the earth and decrease drought. The fourth National Climate Assessment reported that extreme heat waves will become much more common, and that heat is already the leading cause of weather-related deaths in the United States. We are also told that man-made warming is causing an increase in extreme weather deaths linked to these events. So is that the case? The fact is that cold kills considerably more people than heat. It is by far the biggest weather-related killer worldwide. A study of temperature-associated mortality in the United Kingdom and Australia found that cold-related deaths killed more than 15 times as many people in these countries as heat. And in the largest study on deaths related or attributable to heat or cold, a large team of collaborators around the world led by Dr. Antonio Gasparini examined more than 74 million temperature-related deaths in 13 countries. The study revealed that cold weather kills 20 times as many people as heat. Global warming prevents an untold number of premature temperature-related deaths each year. In the United States, summer heat-related deaths have dramatically declined in the last half of the 20th century. Between 1979 and 2006, the United States annual rates from heat death declined by 10%, while deaths from cold fell a dramatic 37%. And finally, in the United States, extreme annual weather-related deaths have declined 98% since the early 20th century. In a response to a question on whether he supports cap and trade, Governor Wolf stated, "We have a problem with climate change. That's a fact. We've seen it all this past year. York County has more rain all over the state, localized flooding. I've never seen this in my lifetime. We are having real problems." Here, the governor makes the common mistake of confusing weather events with climate and then placing them in the improper context and relating that to policy implications. So is flooding increasing? While it is true that increasing temperature should lead to an increase in precipitation, benefiting arid areas while possibly leading to some increase in flooding, the flooding increase has not been revealed in statistics of flooding and rain events. According to the EPA, there's been no increase in years that were wetter than average over the last 130 years. And in Pennsylvania, I looked at the data from NOAA just this week for large rain events for all 721 weather stations across the Commonwealth and found that those big rain events peaked in the 1940s and 50s. If the governor and the legislature decided tomorrow that it was imperative for the state to transition away from fossil fuels, is that even feasible? And would it make any difference? In terms of possible industrial-sized solar development, unless the climate does change significantly, the Commonwealth just isn't well suited for solar generation. Looking at my home city of Pittsburgh, we only get 160 sunny days per year. And with the sun up only an average of 12 hours a day, that means that any solar facility could be operational only 22% of the time. Solar just doesn't work here for industrial scale applications. And that's just as India has concluded due to their long months of monsoon cloud cover and rain. There are currently over 1,300 megawatts of power generated in Pennsylvania from 27 wind farms. That's enough electricity to power only 7% of the households in the state. And the proposals before the governor are sure to greatly increase the need for electricity to power the clean electric vehicles needed to move away from diesel and gasoline. Complicating significant additions to the wind portfolio was the decision last year by the Game Commission to ban all wind projects across its 1.5 million acres, including 180,000 acres that have been identified as attractive for utility-scale wind projects. The banned Game Commission properties represent nearly 20% of all targeted industrial-scale wind projects. The Game Commission found that they were incompatible with its mandates under the code to protect, propagate, manage, and preserve the game and wildlife of the Commonwealth, and promote recreational opportunities. Those same ecological challenges exist across non-PGC properties, and there's growing opposition to these giant turbines. So what would the impact on possible warming be from a complete transition away from fossil fuels? According to the IPCC's own method of calculation, a complete 100% reduction of CO2 for the entire United States, mind you, not just Pennsylvania, would result in a decrease of temperature of between 0.03 of a degree Celsius and 0.06 of a degree Celsius by the year 2050. That's right, less than 1/10 of a degree in warming that would not happen if we completely transitioned away in the United States from CO2. According to a recent study titled Big Cost, Little Difference, the state's current energy mandates will raise energy costs by $700 million and eliminate 11,400 jobs in the Commonwealth. The proposed mandates would only heighten job losses and energy costs. This committee and the governor need to decide if they want to impose additional economically crippling mandates on the state for little to no change in the targeted goals of temperature reduction. Or do we allow the citizens to exercise their freedom of choice in making their own energy decisions for themselves and their families? I thank you. Now I'll open it up to questions from the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Wrightstone. We appreciate it. Members with questions? We'll start with Representative Vitale. If you could limit the questions to one, sir, and then we'll move on to the next and come back around for a second or third round if we have time over the next half hour. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Wrightstone. Thank you for coming today. And, I respect everyone's position, and I think we all have an obligation to listen. But I wanted to read a couple of other positions, and perhaps you can comment on them. This is a letter written by 5 EPA Republican administrators, 1915. There is no longer any credible scientific debate about the basic facts. Our world continues to warm, with the last decade the hottest in modern records. Deep ocean warming faster than the Earth's atmosphere. The lines of scientific evidence grow, only stronger and more numerous. The window of time remaining to act is growing smaller. Delay could mean warming becomes locked in. Here's what the U.S. Department of Defense said. Global climate change will aggravate problems such as poverty, social tension, environmental degradation, ineffectual leadership, and weak political institutions that threaten the stability of countries. Here's what the World Health Organization said. The overall health effects of a changing climate are likely to be overwhelmingly negative. Climate change affects social and environmental determinants of health, clean air, safe drinking water, sufficient food, and secure water. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that human influence on climate systems are clear, and recent anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases are the highest in history. They recently said staying at or below 1.5 Celsius requires slashing of global greenhouse gas emissions by 45% below by 2030. Now, this conclusion was agreed upon by every scientific academic society in the world, as well as 190 countries. This is what the CEO of Exelon said.
Representative Vitale, do you have a question there? We're
it
trying
is.
to pose questions.
I'm going to get it. I think the gentleman.
Mike, I get where you're going.
Okay, let me just.
Thank you.
So this is what, in fact, if I can just, our Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry said, and this was provided by Representative Zabel, in a handout by Representative Metcalf. To be clear, we recognize that a changing climate will present significant challenges to Pennsylvania and the United States, and human activity is a major contributing factor. This is, you're a geologist. This is what the Geological Society of America said. The Geological Society of America concurs with the assessment of the National Academies of Science, the National Research Council, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that global climate has warmed and that human activities account for most of the warming since the middle 1900s. So I guess my question is, with this and I respect the fact you have a master's degree from West Virginia. That's a good school, but with this overwhelming consensus, the conclusions of science who have seen everything that they've reviewed everything that you have reviewed. 190 countries, all the scientific societies of the world, champions of business, the Department of Defense, all of these people have reviewed the same evidence and come to the conclusion climate change is real, it's caused by humans, and we better act. So my question is, why should this committee take your truth as opposed to what the overwhelming science of the world tells us?
All right, well, your long-winded question and discussion here all revolves around a so-called 97% consensus, which is completely, that was created by a study by John Cook. It's been completely discredited. I've devoted an entire chapter in my book to this. Yes, there is a consensus of government institutions that you're going to point to that say this, but this is not, consensus is not science and science is not consensus. I don't know if you know that. That's not the way the scientific process works, and that's not the way we're going to look back, the scientific community is going to look back in 10, 20, or 30 years and be ashamed of what's going on by the silencing of the scientific community concerning any science that doesn't support this consensus opinion. And I just spoke at the, excuse me, Representative, you asked the question. I'm responding to your question.
No,
so
I'm listening. My job is to ascertain what other members want to ask questions.
Well, fine.
Listening to you,
you could do that when I'm done here.
Also,
I've spoken at many scientific organizations. I'm very, very well received. I just spoke to the Ohio Geological Society 2 weeks ago in Columbus, Ohio. 45 geoscientists. There was a consensus there. You're right. It wasn't 97%. It was 100% consensus. Of all the scientists in that room agreed with me, because we as geologists look at the long-term perspective. There have been many. The Oregon petition showed 34,000 degreed scientists that signed that petition that disagreed with that so-called consensus opinion, including Edward Hellert, the father of the hydrogen bomb. Many, many very qualified scientists disagree with that notion. So relying on a consensus to get to that opinion is just, and I don't see it when I talk to scientists around the country. And again, John Cook's study on that has been blown to smithereens in terms of a 97% consensus.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Vitale. Representative Fritz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And good morning. An observation that I've made over the years is that scientists like to challenge one another, debunking theories.
Not anymore. Yeah,
if you will. And what it produces a volley, a healthy volley, in fact. So with that in mind, have your theories or concepts been challenged at all?
I have been challenged by some, but because they want to silence me. They don't want me to talk about what I'm talking about. Most notably, the silence has taken place by Apple, who pulled my smartphone app down out of the App Store. It wasn't because it was because of the content, not the application itself. And that's blown up in the recent weeks. With that, just one example of censoring the type of science the scientific facts that are out there that dispute the consensus opinion on climate change. So yeah, we see this censoring in the scientific community with lack of funding for people that have a contrary opinion. There's only a limited amount of funding available. So the people in charge, if you're invested in this notion of man-made catastrophic warming, you're going to steer that funding data to the people that are going to bolster your opinions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Fritz. Representative Otten.
Mr. Wrightstone, thank you for your testimony today. I actually don't believe in silencing people myself, and so I'm grateful to hear your side of the conversation. I did hear you comment on things like meteorology, game and wildlife, renewable energy, weather patterns, jobs, and economics. And I see here that your credentials are that you are a geologist and an author. And so while I appreciate the science behind the geology of what you're talking about, when my son has an issue with his lungs, I don't ask a cardiologist or a physical therapist what to do about that. So I'd like for you to comment a little bit on your qualifications to discuss things like meteorology, game and wildlife, renewable energy, jobs, and the economy. Do you have background, education, and experience in those things?
My background comes from, I do a lot of political writing concerning science, all science related to climate change. I look at all aspects of climate change, and I've been very involved with this process for some time. So geology puts a lot of these things that you're talking about, the meteorological events, need to be put in the geologic perspective. Things that are going on now, that's primarily what I'm looking at.
But would you agree that you don't have the qualifications to comment on economics and jobs and the weather?
I'm not an economist, but what I do is rely on experts.
You're not an economist. Thank you.
Correct, but I do rely on those that are, and that's the references that you have in front of you are referencing the economic portion of that references those that are. And I certainly have the qualifications to draw on those experts and use that in the book.
Thank you. Kind of interesting coming from politicians when so many politicians claim to be experts on so much that they're really experts on so little of. Representative Zimmerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Wrightstone, for your testimony this morning. You mentioned just a little bit about weather and climate. Can you give me kind of a quick response that I could give someone on the difference between weather and climate, as you kind of referred to?
Yeah, well, I'm tempted to give a lighthearted response that if you believe in the consensus opinion of man-made warming, if it's 90 degrees on March 4th, it's climate, and if it's 15 degrees on March 4th, it's weather, because that tends to be what we get. But we need to put the weather-related issues like Governor Wolf conflated floods in New York and across the country. 2018 was a large precipitation event year, but we look you need to put that in that longer-term perspective of 50 or 100 or 150 years to see if 2018 was just an aberration or was it an event that goes over a period of time. And that's why your question about meteorology has a lot to do with current weather events, where that meteorologic event then needs really to be put in a longer term perspective. So that's what we really need. And we also need to look at those longer term perspectives for temperature. Your question earlier about the last decade being the warmest, on record, and that's true. It is. We're in a warming trend. The last several years should be the warmest on record because we're in a warming trend. But if we look, what we need to do then, though, is say, well, is that unusual and unprecedented? It is if we look at only the last 100 or 150 years. Yes, it is unusual and unprecedented. You need to put it into that long-term perspective going back to the end of the last ice age, and all of a sudden we see that the temperatures we have today are very similar to other warming trends that we're in. So we have to, that's why we need to take these events and really put them in that long-term perspective.
Yeah, appreciate that. I have an 87-year-old father, and he comments often. He has some dementia going on. Comments often of the 1958 snowstorm that's was large in this area, and and that's what he remembers. But that's in the scheme of many years.
You have a commentary I'm writing about that. It's fascinating. I've asked all of my family members about their recollections of snow. Each generation says that the snow when they were children were much. We don't get snows like I was. But I've also got quotes from Thomas Jefferson saying the same thing, because we remember those huge snowfalls, and everybody points to that. All the climate's changing. The fact of the matter, snow cover has actually increased over the last several decades. And when you were 6 years old and an 8-inch snowfall came up above your knees, well, that's what you remember. And so it's fascinating. It's more of a psychological thing when it comes to snowfall. And when we look, again, we look at these things. Again, let's look at the science, the facts, and the data, and that's what's important before this committee and the state to look at what's actually happening.
Yeah.
Thank you, Representative Zimmerman. Representative Kruger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Wrightstone, for joining us here today. So my understanding is that the source of most of the information you shared with us today is your book. Who published your book?
The source is not my book. The source is from peer-reviewed and governmental institutions.
Okay. In doing my homework for this hearing today, I saw articles about your book. So who published your book?
I published it.
Okay, so it's a self-published book.
That's right. I'm very proud of that, by the way. But since you mentioned my book, it did just reach #1 in environmental policy, public policy, climate, and 2 other categories on Amazon. It's been very widely received, and it's not been. It shows clearly sourced and referenced data, showing many aspects of climate change that disagree with that consensus opinion.
I'm glad that your self-published book is doing well in sales. You made a comment that you do a lot of political writing concerning science. What kind of political writing do you do, Mr. Wrightstone?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. What's interesting here, climate change and climate science and the related issues deal with science, but it's hard to separate that. It's become so intertwined since it really deals with political science as half of it, and it's dispelling these, frankly, they're lies about what's happening about climate change. The things that we just went through, some of these I went through, it was forest fires that really, I didn't set out to write a book. I set out to seek the truth, and it was that search for the truth that led me to this, and it was forest fires and droughts that got me hooked. Because when I looked at that and I saw that we're being told that forest fires are increasing because of climate change, and I looked and I found that the science, the facts, and the data were completely opposite, and it wasn't even close. I said, if they're lying to us about this, how can we trust them with anything else? It was the forest fire issue that really got me, and it was so clear. It was stark, clear, and the evidence is so overwhelming, the contrast between what we're being told and what the science, facts, and data tell us. And we see the same thing with droughts and many other of these.
So I do want to note that some of the citations that you included in the section on forest fires are over 20 years old, which does make me question your data. Last question, I saw that you're an advisor.
Representative Kruger, you're on the 4th question, so your 4th question can wait till the next round of second questions, but thank you.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to check something, and I wasn't going to go here until I heard you starting to knock wind and solar, then I've been in this building long enough to know that a lot can be explained by just economic interests following the money. In researching this, it's my understanding, and you tell me if I'm wrong. You have a company that does consulting work for natural gas in Pennsylvania, and if that's true, tell me about the company and how much money you receive from the gas industry.
That's a good question. I had a natural gas. I'm a geologist. I had a consulting company. I offered those services. I've transitioned away from that. When I learned about forest fires and when I got into this and my search for the truth led to this, and I became a climate change fact crusader, I transitioned away from that. I'll have you know that my wife had, because this was a commitment on my part because I felt so strongly about it. My wife at 60 years old had to go back to work because she believed in supporting me. We transitioned away from my consulting to devote myself to exposing the lies and the inaccuracies that are proposed by the consensus climate community. So no, I will take some consulting work if it comes my way, but my focus is on this.
So when's the last time you received money from the
Representative
natural
Vitale,
gas
thank you.
industry?
Representative Vitale, thank you for your second question, but we're going to move on to
Well, it's kind of a
Representative.
follow-up
well,
to the first. It's not
I think
really a
that,
second
I mean, just the
question.
insinuation's kind of insulting to begin with, and he already answered it. I thought in a very, very credible way, very honest way with you. So we're going to move on to Representative Kruger, excuse me, and we'll come back to you for a third question if you like, when we do the third question rounds.
Say
Thank
what
you.
that question is right now.
Representative Kruger.
I'm sorry, I'll defer to Representative Fiedler, who hasn't gotten to ask her first question yet.
Representative Rapp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir, for being here. I appreciate your testimony very much. There's certainly been a lot regarding climate change here in Pennsylvania and in our nation's capital. And in your opinion, as a geologist, it was very interesting when you talked about cold being more dangerous to the human population than heat. Do you believe, in your opinion, as a geologist, that wind and solar, and I'm sure, there are many people benefiting monetarily from wind and solar, do you believe that wind and solar can ever truly replace fossil fuels for driving our economy, and considering that cold is what really is the danger to the human population, do you believe wind and solar can ever truly replace fossil fuels?
I personally don't. I'm not an energy or energy economist expert there, but I rely on those, again, that are. And if we can look at things like, I like to look at India. They're a great example for the rest of the world. They had set a target of 55% for renewable energy, and that's hydro or hydroelectric, wind, and solar. Just 2 weeks ago, the Indian government released a study that said we cannot get to that 50%. We're scaling it back to a 30% target for renewables, and they stated we're probably not going to get that. And the reason is they go through their monsoon seasons, so the solar doesn't make sense, just like it doesn't make sense here in Pennsylvania, really, for industrial scale solar. Wind is not going to get them where they need because we need backups. The wind doesn't blow. Sometimes it blows too hard for wind to work. So what we need is fossil fuel powered or nuclear powered electricity generation facilities to back up wind and solar. India has doubled down on coal-fired electric. Just in this report 2 weeks ago, they announced they're opening 20 new lignite and coal mines in India, and they were increasing their investment in coal-fired electrical generation capabilities. India has concluded, and they were very, very committed to this. They've concluded that the only way that they're going to, and they just achieved what they claim is 100% electrification of the entire country, which is hugely important. Now we've lifted billions of people out of energy poverty, and that's how we lift people out of generational poverty, by providing affordable, reliable energy for the poorest among us.
Thank you, sir. Isn't it true? I mean, and I'm not an expert on wind turbines or solar or even oil and gas, but isn't it true? And I know I'm asking you as a geologist, that wind and solar takes a lot of fossil fuel to manufacture, and indeed, with wind turbines, it takes oil to run those turbines.
Yeah, it does take a lot of fossil fuels. Probably one of the most ecologically damaging part of the wind turbines and the solar panels are those rare earth minerals that need to be mined in Mongolia. And I'm sure you've probably maybe read some of the information and seen some of the horrible ecological disasters of these rare earth mines, mainly in China and parts of the rural areas of China. We're going to be left with a real ecological disaster at some point in the future, because each wind turbine only has a set number of decades of life, and each one of those solar panels, all of these things will need to be disposed of at some point. So there's, I thought it was telling that the Game Commission in Pennsylvania decided in a unanimous vote to ban wind turbines on their properties, and it was for a number of reasons. It wasn't just they kill birds. I think that's overrated. I don't go there, but they're dangerous. They throw off ice in the winter that are very dangerous. And these things, they would have to make large parts of the Game Commission lands off limits to hunters, which is their main focus, is providing wildlife.
Thank you for being here. I think it's valuable to get some of your beliefs on the record for this committee. And I agree with you that we are on course for a real ecological disaster. A quick Google search of your name turned up your work as an advisory board member for the Heartland Institute. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us about the Heartland Institute and who funds their work?
I frankly don't know. I'm an advisory board member and I don't get paid. They publish, I write commentaries and they publish them. That's been the extent of it so far. They're a very well-respected organization, but I don't take any money from them or anyone else. And they provide expert opinions throughout the United States on matters of energy, economics, and climate. But I'm not. I'm an advisory board member, and that's all I can say.
If I may just ask one quick follow-up?
I will say I'm a contributing writer also to the Cornwall Alliance, which is a Christian group, and we believe as this group believes that we should use all of Earth's, or what they call God's creation, all of Earth's resources for the betterment of mankind, and do it as good stewards. And it's surprising how many people actually disagree with that opinion, that we should use everything for the betterment of mankind and do it wisely. So I think, you bring up the Heartland. This is the other group I'm associated with.
And you said that you were unaware of where their funding came from. I can tell you that Heartland's funding comes from ExxonMobil, the American Petroleum Institute, and Alpha Natural Resources. And last November, Frontline posted a story on the Heartland Institute calling it a climate denialist group.
Yeah, well, I've never met anyone who is a climate denialist. I know lots of climate skeptics. That's a much terrible derogatory term. I have never met a climate denier, and I know a lot of skeptics. And Heartland is not a climate denialist institution. You can make ad hominem attacks on me and that organization, but you should not use the term denier, because they are not.
Thank you. Yeah, people have used that directed at me also. I don't think we deny there's a climate. There's 4 seasons a year here in Pennsylvania. We get regular climate changes, and I don't think anybody would deny that climate changes. But
and I open with my testimony saying that carbon dioxide has a warming effect on the atmosphere. That's not denial. And I'm admitting that, yes, there is warming and it has a warming effect. So, yes, we disagree on the severity and what's the primary cause of the warming and access to wildlife for the hunters.
Thank you. Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Wrightstone, for your testimony. I'm relatively new to this position, and this topic in particular tends to have a lot of varied opinions. Let's just say it that way. So what advice would you give to not only me but fellow politicians that are new to the role, maybe examining this issue from the standpoint of an elected position for the first time? What advice would you give? What resources could we go to?
Yeah, don't rely on this 97% consensus. Keep an open mind. Lean on experts for information. Don't follow the crowd. There's a lot of very, very bad information on climate change out there. As you know, it's hard to get to the truth of the matter and get to the bottom of a lot of this because we hear so much contradictory information. And again, that's what led me to become a climate crusader for the truth about climate change. So I'd say people on both sides should keep an open mind. Don't march with the lemmings off the cliff. I'm convinced that in 10, 20, or 30 years, the scientific community is going to be look back and be ashamed of this process of climate change denial, of the facts of true climate change, and realize that we've gotten away from the scientific process that should be driving the discussion instead of silencing others with any dissenting opinions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wrightstone, for entertaining all the questions for your presentation. The next committee, I believe, is nipping at our heels to leave the room. So we kind of push right up against the 9:30 mark. But thank you so much for all of your time today and for making the trip out. We really appreciate your work and appreciate you being here to share your expertise with us today. We appreciate that expertise and helping us to debunk some of the myths that are out there in the public right now. And we need more of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Motion to adjourn by Representative Rapp, seconded by Representative Warner. This meeting's adjourned. Everyone have a great day.